Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's my honor to appear before you today. I'd like to thank Jan Harzen for inviting me to appear here today and discuss my experiences in the CIA's Mars Jump Room program. I'd really like to ask everybody to put your hands together with me and really commend this wonderful, intelligent, and honest individual, Jan Harzen, who is taking this great organization into the 21st century. Thank you, Jan, for your wonderful leadership. Okay, how's that? Is that loud enough? Okay, now where is my, there we go. Oh, okay. My presentation today is about my experiences in the CIA's Mars Jump Room program. Those experiences had their origins in DARPA's time-space program, Project Pegasus, which I served in from 1968 to 72 as a child. Here I am in kindergarten, about a year before I became the first American child to teleport. Okay, let's do that. You want to swap that out? Okay. When I became the first American child to teleport, my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, had repeated Tesla's teleportation experiments when he was working at the Thomas A. Edison Research Laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey, from 1956 to 64. And when the US government began to cobble together a time travel program under DARPA in the mid-1960s, at the time that my father went to work for Parsons Jordan Corporation, a subsidiary of the Ralph M. Parsons Company of New York City, one of the world's largest process engineering companies, he wanted to demonstrate to Harold Agnew, the director of the weapons division at the Los Alamos Labs, that if teleportation was safe enough for his 6-year-old son, his number 3 son, it was safe enough for anybody's child. And so I leapt into the emergent time-space program of our government as a 6-year-old in the winter of 1968, about a year before this picture was taken. When I was serving on Project Pegasus, predominantly in the early 1970s, there was a discussion between the defense attaché for Project Pegasus and my late father at a bar in Albuquerque, New Mexico, that when the children in the program reached high school age, they would then be admitted to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis as a pretext for involving them in future project activities. So one of the questions that's sort of been lingering these 3 days at the conference is, what was the secret space program? What is it? What will it be? I can tell you that I was being groomed in childhood. I was being educated in time travel so that I could go to the Naval Academy and continue to time travel in adulthood. I declined that offer, however, when an interview, you have to have one of those admission interviews with your local congressman. In my case, Barry Goldwater Jr., the son of Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, at his offices in Woodland Hills, California, and I stood up the interview. I essentially did not go after it was scheduled, and Barry Goldwater Jr.'s secretary called me and bawled me out for about 10 minutes on the phone. I was all of 16 years old, but I explained that I simply didn't want to go into a culture in which I would be yelled at a lot in the face by going to a military academy and then entering the U.S. military, which I obviously have very high esteem for. I basically was working in a sort of a quasi-status as a Navy officer, time traveling for the country, and I certainly am very grateful for the various Army personnel and so forth who were protecting us, but I just didn't want to experience that during my college years. And so I basically failed to take the bid and go where I was supposed to go to continue time traveling. Now, I ended up being placed in the Mars Jump Room program anyway during my undergraduate years at UCLA. So now, what is it? It's been 37 years since I was trained in the summer of 1980 to go to Mars via Jump Room. When I look back and take stock of anything in my childhood that related to Mars, here's what I found. First of all, I found 5 foreshadowings that indicated that Project Pegasus, and indeed my father and the principals on it, knew that some of the children who were time traveling for DARPA in the early 70s would be going to Mars in adulthood. As it turned out, it was in our young adulthood. The first incident occurred in 1968 when I was first teleporting to New Mexico. My dad came back from his job at Parsons in New York City to our home in humble Morris Plains, New Jersey. And he gathered my four older brothers and sisters and my mother and I together in the living room and said, listen to this. It's hysterical. I want to read this to you. It's about somebody describing life on Mars for the first time. And what this actually was a summary of all of the sort of farcical parts of a paper that I wouldn't write until 2008. So let me just stress at the outset what I'm alleging. I'm alleging that by 1968, literally with the election of Richard Nixon, the assassination of RFK and Dr. King, our intelligence community and defense technical community were already operating on a non-local basis. They were already sending time travelers to our future to see things and do things and retrieve documents and retrieve artifacts and bring them back. One of those artifacts was my 2008 paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. Because as some of you may know, it's the first paper to prove that Mars has an indigenous humanoid and animal biosphere, that it's an inhabited planet. And we were going to it in antiquity. We've been going to Mars by conventional rocketry since 1964. So we were using our time travel capability on Earth to go into the immediate future and find out what were some of the important documents that they could take back to inform the defense technical function in the present. So they had my 2008 paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. As my dad was reading these passages, the most farcical, where I provided fanciful names for some of the creatures that I found in NASA image PIA 10214 in 2008, my dad began laughing hysterically because somebody apparently at CIA had gone into my paper and just gleaned about a page and a half of the most funny or farcical material. Sensing that something was up, I ran across the living room, grabbed the file folder out of my dad's hands, and ran up the stairs to the second level of the house reading what was in there. It said CIA memorandum, and then the credit line at the top of the memo read, read, Andrew Basiago, The Discovery of Life on Mars, 2008. Okay, so I've had somewhat of a strange existence in the sense that aspects of my future were interpolated into my childhood and my college years as a result of the emerging quantum access capability of the United States government. Let's see here. Well, I've got a blank screen there. A year later, summer of 1969, my dad was giving me a haircut up in one of the bedrooms of our house in Morris Plains, and he stopped halfway through the crew cut he was giving me and said, son, I want to show you something. He opened up a manila envelope with one of those red wax seals and showed me this photograph, which we're going to try to bring up. Do we have that? I don't see it there. I don't know. Am I connected to the screen? Is it coming up? Okay. And what it was the finding I made in 2008 of the humanoid being on Tsiolkovsky Ridge. And my dad had sort of a colloquy with me that this was a Martian on Mars that I would discover in the future and put in a famous paper about life on Mars. The next summer of 1970, there we go. So we get some figures from popular culture, and it shows. Not Martians, but some very human actors. I'm using Mike Myers here and Jackie Coogan from the Austin Powers films and from the Addams Family on television to demonstrate sort of the rugged, bald nature of the Martian humanoids who are our genetic relatives on Mars. Summer 1970, my dad takes me over to a hangar at the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, where the Tesla teleportation device to New Mexico was that we were jumping through from 1968. But this was another structure there at Curtiss-Wright, a big hangar. And 3 Martian astronauts were leaving an air technical liaison meeting with my dad and several other of our air defense engineers. And they stopped and had a discussion with my dad in perfect, unaccented English. So I can personally verify through eyewitness testimony that we were in liaison with our genetic relatives on Mars by no later than summer of 1970. Missing something there. Oh, I see. Fall of 1971, I'm sick as a result of trick-or-treating with a severe case of bronchitis. And my dad comes into my sick room, opens up another manila envelope, and hands me my 2008 paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, 37 years before I would research it and write it. And he said, son, the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to go away for a couple hours. I want you to read your paper, study its contents, study the photographs, try to relate the caption material to the photographs. And I said, why, Dad? Why are you having me read this paper, decades before I write it? He said, because when you do write it, we want it to contain as much information about life forms on Mars as possible. So I think that really shows the fact that as time travel was emerging, they really didn't have a handle on what they were doing in terms of the interpolation, for example, of future data in the present. Because after all, when I researched and wrote my paper in 2008, I could only have 100% of content in that paper. So if, in fact, there was going to be any benefit reading it 37 years earlier when I was a child, a 10-year-old, in fall of 71, I could only remember 100% of what it was in the paper, right? I couldn't remember 100+% of what was in the paper. So the idea that somehow they were going to work this quantum enrichment by having me pre-read a paper I wouldn't write for 37 years, I think is somewhat doubtful, but it was the kind of activities that were going on as time travel was emerging, and they were trying to engage in better contingency planning for present and future events as a result of quantum accessing both past and future data. So I was given the opportunity to read my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars. Was it from the future? Yes. Why do I know that? Because it had not only my middle initial D, which I wouldn't acquire until my confirmation as a Roman Catholic a number of years later, for Daniel, the name that I took as my confirmation name, my middle name, but also it had the distinctive Microsoft Arial type font in the headline and the byline and so forth, which would not emerge until Microsoft Word would emerge in the future. So it was my paper from the future. When I was serving on Project Pegasus, the fifth sort of Mars foreshadowing in my childhood, I was at the La Hacienda restaurant in Albuquerque in the company of my dad's longtime friend, Mary Constance Chavez, also known as Connie Chavez, a native Albuquerque, indeed an Old Town Albuquerque resident. My dad came back from a technical meeting that had taken place during lunch, and about an hour after lunch, he looked jaundiced. I mean, he looked like he had just been punched in the stomach. And Connie said to my dad, "What's wrong, Ray?" And he said, "Well, let's go over here to this side of the restaurant. I don't want Andy to hear this." But I zigzagged across the restaurant and ultimately heard Connie ask my father, "Does he go up there before or after he finds all those critters up there?" Which was her understanding that I would write my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, and my dad was now informing Connie, sort of my mother away from home when I was in New Mexico rather than in my home state of New Jersey, having teleported to New Mexico on a project basis. And my dad was sharing with her, undoubtedly, the fact that he had just been briefed on the fact that I and some of the other kids in Project Pegasus were destined for Mars. We were destined for the secret astronaut corps. So I left Pegasus in 1972. I had a fairly ordinary junior high school, and initial college period in Southern California. I spent a year at UC San Diego before transferring in my sophomore year, at the beginning of my sophomore year, to UCLA, because my dad instructed me, we're going to be doing some things up here next year, the next school year, so you need to put in a transfer and come up to UCLA. I did. That summer, the summer of 1980, the summer after my first year of college, he came to me in our living room in Chatsworth, California, and explained that he and I were going to be going camping together just as father and son. And when I asked him where, he said up around Mount Shasta, where we had vacationed as a larger family group in the late 1970s. We drove up to the Lake Siskiyou area, where we planned to camp on the northern shore of Lake Siskiyou in beautiful Shasta country. But before going up to the campsite, my dad stopped at the McLeod Market in McLeod, California, which is about 9 miles, several freeway off-ramps from the campsite there at Lake Siskiyou. And my dad, who was clean-shaven, turned to me in the car and said, "Son, I'm going to be going to the market now for about 15 minutes. I want you to stay in the car, stay with the car. I don't want you to leave. Do everything you can to stay in the car. I'll be out in about 15 minutes. And true to his word, about 15 minutes later, my dad came back to the car with about a 5-day growth of beard. And I said, Dad, wait a minute here. You were clean shaven. It looked like you had shaved this morning before we left. We left about 5 o'clock in the morning to go to Shasta. And he said, well, you know how I always let my beard grow, Andy, when we're camping. You know, family's always been kidding me about looking like Ernest Hemingway in his dotage, you know. And I said, no, Dad, something's up here. You just came back to the car with 5-day growth of beard. What happened? And he said, look, I can't talk about it, but it's fine. Don't worry. What apparently happened is he had undergone some form of time travel in which he must have attended a seminar, I believe probably a pre-seminar to the Mars training that we would then experience, and didn't have an opportunity to shave after spending a number of days in that seminar, and then was time traveled back to be able to walk out of the market. So there must have been some kind of egress between the market and some portal, or maybe, I know that there's an intelligence base under the Shasta Dam. Maybe he was taken by automobile from behind the market. Maybe he walked over to a medical lab that's behind the market. I don't know. But he disappeared for 15 minutes and came back with a pretty substantial, at least several day growth of beard. I would say about 5 days. I didn't know at the time, I was 18 in summer of 80. I didn't know at the time that a 13-year-old from Southern California, William Brett Stillings, whose father worked for Lockheed Skunk Works, not the Ralph M. Parsons Company, was having an identical experience, except Brett has explained how his father, Thomas Stillings of Lockheed, shaved in the car before going into the McLeod market and still coming out with about a 2-day growth of beard. So clearly our fathers had been enrolled in some sort of pre-seminar. So we go up to the campsite, we meet the Stillings. They came over, they were our next door neighbors at the campsite. Tom Stillings, who was a hail fellow, well met, very funny guy, Brett's dad, comes over to our campsite and says to my father, you don't know me, but we work for the same company. And I don't have to say that non-CIA employees usually don't say that to each other upon meeting, that we work for the same company. So we had some discussions there. I remember that Tom Stillings sent Brett to the car. They had an orange Vanagon, and he got a shoebox. And Tom took a piece of metal maybe about the width of, I don't know, the aluminum in lawn chairs, and maybe about the length of a chalk eraser. And he said, now watch this, Andy, and he just dropped it, and it hovered 3 inches above the ground. And he explained that this wasn't an anti-gravitic effect, it was a reverse magnetic effect in so-called boundary layer material. And then he turned to my father and said, Ray, I don't have to show this to you because you've worked with this. So presumably my dad's aerospace career from the 1950s, where he had designed the metal alloy by which the ramjet was built, where he had worked on the instrumentation for the B-70, which was going to be the atomic-equipped strategic bomber, the flying Chernobyl, had continued into the 1970s and 80s, because here we have Tom referring to it. So, God, do I have a slide there? There we go. Okay. So we spend Saturday there, and then Sunday at 1 o'clock, my father and Mr. Stillings get up at the same time and start walking diagonally across the campsite. Brett being 13 and myself being 18, we sort of run ahead of our dads and into the campsite that they seem to be heading towards. There was a truck and a camper, or a pickup truck and a car, I don't remember which, but 2 different kind of vehicles in the front of that campsite, and a man walked through the 2 vehicles and greeted Brett and I, and we definitely know who he was. He was astronaut Edwin Aldrin, the second human being, at least during this epoch of civilization, to set foot on the moon. And he greeted us in a very genial manner and said, Andy, Brett, pleased to meet you fellows. Well, let me tell you, you two are going to be doing something in a couple years that I did a few years back, and that's go off planet. And let me tell you fellas, it's going to be the experience of a lifetime. So we meet Aldrin there at the campgrounds the day before we're put in Mars jump room training. That night around the campfire, my dad explained, basically clarified what Buzz was referring to by stating that we were going to be entering an academic program the next day involving everything to do with Mars. And when I said, why, Dad? I mean, I don't want to become an astronaut. I've already completed my astronomy breadth requirement. He said, because some of you kids in the program are going to be going there. So we knew by Sunday night that we basically were being dropped into the secret space program. although that's certainly not how we conceptualized it at that time. Okay, the next morning we're taken up to this building, which at that time had nothing around it. Now it's all built out around it, which is the University Extension Building of College of the Siskiyous in Wairika, California. Later we would meet at the Life Sciences Building on the main campus of College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California, near Mount Shasta. And right there at the Extension Building, we met our instructor, who was then serving as, according to his own internet biography, his own website-based biography, Major Ed Dames, was then serving as a scientific and technical intelligence officer for the U.S. Army. So we meet our professor, and the program that we're being enrolled in is explained to us, that basically we're going to study for about 6 weeks everything from the creation of Mars to why the United States is there, and because some of us being trained are going to be going there. It was explained that the United States government was sending both settlers there and temporary visitors, and we had essentially pulled the more favorable card because we were just going to be temporary visitors there. Ed explained to us that there were 3 goals as to why we had established a secret Mars program, and they were to establish an extraterrestrial defense regime on planet Mars to protect Earth from all of the above, from asteroids, hostile ETs, mysterious events that might jeopardize our planetary civilization here on planet Earth. So there was a defense goal that we would be serving, that in order to implement that defense regime, there was an effort being made to potentially claim Mars as U.S. territory under public international law, which at least in the case of Antarctica was done by showing how your country had involved itself in a pattern of sending both temporary visitors and settlers to Antarctica. So the United States government was going to attempt the same territorial acquisition of Mars as U.S. territory, and that in service of that goal, we would be sent up there primarily to acclimate the Martian humanoids and animals to our presence. As Ed Dames joked, your goal basically is to go up there and be seen and not eaten. So initially we were just being sent as temporary visitors. So working with us as a group of gifted and talented young people, we were involved in different things that they wanted to make sure that as a team and as individuals we possessed. So the emphasis included what to expect upon arriving on Mars via jump room, to learn about both the lethal and the non-lethal predators on the surface. And by that I mean there was a class of about 5 to 6 carnivores among the 30 major land animals that we were trained about. And they wanted us to know the several predators that were so violent, so dangerous, that there'd be very little chance of us evading them if they focused on us with the desire to eat us. The other 3 or 4 we might be able to outrun. So we had a major component on predators on the surface, and they wanted us to be able to operate as a team so that we could keep each other alive when we were there. It was certainly not their goal for us to go up there and get eaten alive, although some of us were. Now, in consultation with 2 of my fellow jumpers, again, William Brett Stillings, and a defense community investigator who was somewhat older, who was dropped into our group of 5, as a threesome of whistleblowers. Again, we had a discussion at the panel. Evidence just doesn't include documents, it also includes testimony. Both testimony as to what witnesses saw and did, and documents where chain of custody have been proven, are valid forms of evidence. And they usually all can go into the body of evidence to be evaluated by the fact finders at a trial. So I'm providing, admittedly, testimonial evidence. And I have the right to give that evidence and have it be considered, testimony as to what I did or saw, have it be considered as direct evidence. Now, my testimony about the 5 people in the program we've been able to identify has been corroborated by William Stillings and Bernard Mendez. That's, of course, a hearsay allegation. We'd have to get them to testify to confirm that. But this has been backed up by 2 of my co-participants. The trainees, in addition to myself, included Regina Elvira Dugan, who had just completed or entered her first year at Caltech as a 16-year-old, and who on July 20th of 2009, the 40th anniversary of the lunar landing, was appointed by President Obama the 19th director of DARPA. In fact, the first woman to direct the very agency that gave the United States government its secret time travel capability. An Annapolis plebe that was in our training class, as I was supposed to have gone to Annapolis, this young man decided to go, was William Cameron McCool, who would later become a Navy test pilot and space shuttle pilot, and sadly lose his life on February 1st of 2003, piloting Space Shuttle Columbia as it re-entered Earth atmosphere and was incinerated. So Willie McCool was in our class. There was a very intelligent and funny and likable young man who was then attending Occidental College, who explained to me that his name was Barry Soetoro, who was also in our training class. Today we know him as President Barack Obama. So let me ask this very intelligent audience. If William Stillings and Bernard Mendez and I were telling a tall tale, if we were constructing a fable hoping to be believed, back in 2010 when we came public with this testimony, would we have included the sitting President of the United States as one of our fellow jumpers? I mean, please, it's a farcical, it's a silly idea. We never would have included Obama. I actually had arguments with Alfred Weber. Judge Weber was then advising us about what kind of truth movement to pursue. And we decided we would tell the truth about Obama's involvement because, guess what? He was one of our fellow jumpers. Now, I have great respect and affection for Richard Dolan, but you know, Richard has satirized my testimony as the Obama on Mars story. It's not. If anything, it's my own story of Basiago on Mars. But in fact, I think it goes beyond my own participation. I'm trying to tell the story of the CIA's Mars Jump Room program as a component of the secret space program. So yes, Obama was involved. His service was no more distinguished than mine or any other jumper of that age, but he was involved. So has President Obama lied to the American people about the fact that he's a former American astronaut or chrononaut, if you will? Yes. And today we're going to look at the lies that he told as president to conceal his ties to the CIA and his background working for the U.S. government in his early 20s, as I did. And then, of course, William Brett Stillings was in the training class as well. So we've identified 5 of the teenagers. I averaged and derived their median average of their age at onset of training, which was 17. And what do you know? That's the age that Corey Goode and Randy Kramer have claimed they entered the secret space program in terms of actively participating in it. Kind of curious that I averaged 5 teenagers' ages, and we got the same age 17, as Corey and Randy. Isn't that interesting? The other 5 participants, we don't know their names, although one of them may have been, this was a blonde young man from UC Santa Barbara named Eric Schoenfeld. So Eric, if you're out there or you hear this, please contact us. Okay, then of course there was a federal investigator. He was introduced to us on kind of a special basis as somebody who was being dropped into the program as a participant observer to study some of the mysteries that were occurring, and that was Bernard Mendez, who then would come forward as a whistleblower in 2011. Now, in trying to understand the selection process for this cadre of teenagers and individuals in their early 20s that they were sending to Mars, we have to rely on the testimony of Bernard Mendez. Curiously, the selection process, to some extent, as Bernie and I would later discuss, probably had a connection to NASA JPL, which is based in Pasadena, California, because all 5 of the 10 teenage trainees that we've been able to identify had some esoteric connection, at least, to Pasadena, California. I was the son of a career employee of the Ralph M. Parsons Company, which moved from New York City to Pasadena in 1972, right as I was leaving Pegasus. I mentioned that Regina Dugan had just completed her first year of studies at Caltech, which is based, in Pasadena, California as well. William Cameron McCool would later serve as a space shuttle pilot for NASA JPL, headquartered in Pasadena. Barack Obama was attending Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, which is essentially a suburb of Pasadena. And Brett Stillings was growing up in La Cañada, California, which again is a kind of an adjacent suburb of greater Pasadena. So we think there was a covert NASA connection of some kind, but we were under the CIA. Now, what were some of the human factors that Bernie cited years later that they were looking for in this cadre of young people? Whoops. First of all, they were looking for people with high IQs. They were placing some faith on the notion that if we're going to be sending young people to another planet in space, let's select high IQ individuals. They also were looking for individuals who had a familiarity with living on the land by camping and hiking and having, I would even say, sort of an environmental or even an ecotopian kind of orientation or outlook. And they were also looking, Bernie said, for cooperative individuals. They didn't want individuals who would see a hill on the surface of Mars and say, beat you to the top of the hill. They wanted people who would say, hey, let's walk up and go up on top of that hill and see what we can see from on top of that hill. Because again, they wanted to sort of promote teaming and team reliance for survival. Now, during those 6 weeks, there were 3 parents who attended every lecture. They were my father on the left. Here's my dad at 1951, a year before we had the famous overflight of Washington, D.C. By 9 craft clocked at traveling at 7,000 miles per hour above our nation's capital by Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. It remains disputed as to whether they were extraterrestrials piloting those vehicles or some surviving Nazi contingent. I believe they were extraterrestrials. I have great respect for Dr. Sala, who believes that he's established that they in fact were being piloted by Nazis. So I remain open-minded to that explanation. My dad was working for Okanite in Paramus, New Jersey in October of 1952 when a bird colonel from the Air Force showed up at the side of his desk and gave him orders to report to Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company in Woodridge, New Jersey the next Monday to work on the Ramjet, which was one of the high-performance, high-speed jet aircraft projects that were undertaken to chase the Nazis or the ETs away from our country. So that's, my dad really remained in the defense technical community from that moment forward. So here's this picture at about the age that he got brought into the ET cover-up, the Nazi cover-up, if you will, whatever we find out ultimately were the threats that they were responding to. I remember being told in a seminar that the 2 major threats that the U.S. intelligence community was concerned of, not in the early 50s, but by the early 70s, was, believe it or not, a Soviet land invasion, that is, an invasion by the Soviet Army in the continental United States, or a global coastal flooding event resulting initially from global warming. So my dad's entire career in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s was for the U.S. defense community. Also attending all of those lectures, sitting behind Brett and I, was William Stillings' father, Tom Stillings of Lockheed, an operations analyst for Lockheed of Pasadena, seen here in his naval Lieutenant JG uniform. And also Barack Obama's adoptive or biological mother or handler for the CIA possibly, Stanley Ann Dunham, also known as Ann Dunham. A highly intelligent woman who gave a one-day lecture about cultural, cross-cultural communications that was truly worthy of a Margaret Mead. She was a phenomenal intellect, President Obama's mother, or the woman who raised him, and it really showed when she lectured our class on how to behave if we found ourselves in cross-cultural communications on Mars with Martians. Now, after about 5 weeks, we're almost ending the educational program, and Barack Obama, then known as Barry Soetoro, Regina Dugan and I, also known as Regina Dugan, and I were ordered to report to Ed Dames there, his office there at College of the Siskiyous. We did, and we were then greeted by Ed Dames and my father. And they explained that we would be teleported to the beginning of the summer. Okay, so this is now late August, early September of 80, but they would teleport us to the beginning of June of 1980, where we would be sequestered on the campus there to do our thesis, our contribution to the CIA's threat assessment on the indigenous Martian humanoid civilization. And specifically what CIA asked us to do, as a young man who was later destined to attend Harvard Law School, a young woman who would ultimately earn her PhD in mechanical engineering from Caltech, and as a future Cambridge-educated lawyer, myself on the right, we were asked to analyze a 4-inch thick dossier of documents gathered about the Martian humanoid civilization by the French External Intelligence Organization, seen here in its logo. And I remember asking, when we basically were released from that sequestration, we were walking to Ed Dame's office and could finally talk about what we had written for the threat assessment. I concluded that the Martian humanoid civilization was not a threat to our civilization. Regina cited an incident in which 2 US astronauts had crash-landed on Mars via rocket in 1964, and the Martian humanoids had originally agreed to rescue them, but then had reneged, and they died on the surface. And she was very adamant that that incident indicated that they did not have our best interests at heart. But Barack Obama, being destined for the presidency, at least first, vis-a-vis myself, did not tell us what his conclusion was. I think that's kind of telling. But Regina was really adamant that, if they didn't want to rescue our jeopardized astronauts crash landing there, that we really couldn't rely on them or trust them as a civilization. But I beg to differ, basically arguing, look, we are the hegemon, we're the interloper on their planet. Look at how we presumably have treated ETs, when they've crash landed on our planet. I haven't seen any welcoming committees or ticker tape parades. So I just wanted to, but I didn't want to prejudge the situation, because after all, if the facts in the French intelligence document were correct, the Martian humanoid civilization would have been under no ethical duty to rescue an interloper, a hegemon, of their territorial sovereignty and security, their very territoriality. Now, during the seminar, Barack Obama got up to talk to our instructor, Ed Dames, and Thomas Stilling said to his son, Brett, within earshot of my father and I, we were sitting next to them, Brett, how do you feel being in a Mars training program like this with a future president? Indicating Barry Soetoro, later to become Barack Obama. And before Brett could answer, my father thrust 2 fingers into the aisle between Tom and Brett and us, and looking at me with his eye twitching. My dad had a nervous tic. Every time he was consternated, this little muscle in his right eye would start twitching. And looking at me, he said, 2 future presidents. So we then had a discussion when we drove Barry to the Hoopa Indian Reservation to fly to Portland to fly and visit his grandparents in Hawaii one weekend, about the fact, what my dad was describing, that Barry and I were indeed identified in the seminar as future presidents. But he never described why they would put 2 future presidents in a Mars program. In other words, why would they have sent 2 future presidents, presumably people that you wouldn't want to get killed or traumatized too greatly going to another planet? And I can only speculate, but among the speculations I've entertained is, first, they were trying to groom us for the great stress of serving as president, if in fact one or both of us did end up president, as was indicated by the quantum access capabilities that the US government had been involved in, quite frankly, at that point for 10 years. Maybe they knew we would survive and become president, so by involving us, they knew there were at least 2 participants who wouldn't get eaten by predators on the surface. And then maybe there were deeper political considerations. Maybe they were planning on normalizing relations between the Martian humanoid civilization and our own. Maybe they knew that there were secret issues that would have to be confronted during the Obama and Basiago years dealing with Mars. But this is part of the story. And again, I can prove the fact to Richard Dolan with documents that I'm a past member of Mensa. I can prove that I was identified as a mentally gifted minor having an IQ of at least 140. It was actually 168 when I was tested, and therefore was treated as a mentally gifted minor by the state of California. I can show him my yearbook from class of 1979 that I was a National Merit Finalist. Why would a high IQ person not only be asserting that Barack Obama was in his Mars program, but that when he was in it, Obama and he were identified as future presidents? I mean, if I was making up a story and wanted to be believed, I wouldn't be doing that. It stresses the very limits of credibility, of believability, but that's in fact what happened. Because in consultation with Judge Weber, I decided that, look, if the truth movement is going to mean anything, the people coming forward as whistleblowers have to uphold only one duty, and that's to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and that's what I'm doing. So That, in fact, is what happened during the program. There was a discussion of the fact that Barry and I were future presidents, but no reasons were given for our involvement. Well, I'm not getting in advance here. Oh, there we go. Okay, the clicker. Okay, so that's not coming up. Okay, so we have the 6-week seminar. I interact with Barry, Regina, Brett, some of the people I'd later be seeing in the program, Willie McCool. I would sometimes see. Is there any way we can bring that in at the jump room? Okay, 2 future presidents. That's good. Can we go on to the next one? Okay, thank you. The next summer, we're back in Southern Cal. We obviously returned from Shasta. I do my second year of college. It's summer of '81. I'm now a UCLA junior, at least to enter in the fall of '81. And in the summer of '81, they put a second Mars training officer in my life after Ed Dames, and that was Courtney Maurice Hunt, a career CIA officer. Now, as a lawyer, I'm building my case about my participation in time travel and Mars exploration using a specific form of evidential development as a trial lawyer. It's called variously the iterative method or the inundative method. And that's where you put 100 facts or 200 facts at the feet of the jury to show that your case is unassailable. So when I just stated that my second Mars training officer was this career CIA officer, Courtney Maurice Hunt, I'm doing that for the benefit of able researchers like Dr. Michael Salla, who have begun the process of proving my time travel and ultimately one day my Mars claims by digging into the government records using the Freedom of Information Act. So Hunt was career CIA, and I'm certain that when Michael gets to that part of his investigation of my claims, we're going to find a lot of documents on Courtney Hunt. Courtney strongly resembled this man. Could I have some assistance here? I'm not getting any advance on the PowerPoint. There we go. It's just a little behind. Thank you. Courtney resembled Mike Roman. This is a picture from the grand ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel on the night that Senator Robert Kennedy was shot there, June 5th of 1968. Courtney so resembled this man seen standing in the ballroom that he was actually questioned by the FBI as to whether he was this gentleman. This gentleman was originally believed to be Gordon Campbell of the CIA. He later proved to be Michael Roman, the president and chief executive officer of the Bulova Watch Company, actually serving under General Omar Bradley, who was the top official there at Bulova, I guess the CEO. So this was Mike Roman, the president of the Bulova Watch Company. But this is essentially what Courtney Hunt looked like in his early 50s when he trained me in summer of 1981 for Mars. It's just going to have to wait. So under his tutelage that summer, could I have some assistance in the PowerPoint here? It's not advancing. I'm pointing it, yeah. It's just not moving. Can I do it manually on the computer? Second one, okay, one more. Right, that's it. Okay, thank you. It's not coming up. Okay, well, I'll just work through here. Among the things, I could use a jump room at this time, yeah. But among the things that Courtney did is he took me over to Cal State Northridge. This is a picture of Cal State Northridge. And he showed me the respiration device that we would be taking to Mars. Is that it? Yeah, on the right there's Cal State Northridge. Sir, could you come here and advance this? I can't see the buttons here. There's too much glare. So among the things he covered was more lecturing about the predators on Mars. And what I have here is a picture of a predator that's ubiquitous on the Martian surface that I've called a plesiosaur. The plesiosaurs on Earth were an aquatic reptile with a bulky body like a turtle. Could you just hang here and we'll go through? Thanks. With a bulky body like a tortoise, a long neck like a snake, and a head like a horse with teeth in it. Some of the lake monsters that have been seen at Loch Ness, Lake Champlain, and Lake Okanagan in British Columbia have been attributed possibly to this species. But they're all over the Martian surface. They are predators. And so he was clarifying for me the fact that I had to keep my eye out on things that looked like boulders, because sometimes they were plesiosaurs that were just sort of lurking. And then they would raise their snake-like neck and head, and they could run you down and eat you, but you could probably outrun them. Next one, please. But unlike one of the inevitably lethal predator species, which was about a 16-foot tall dinosaur-like species that had a head like a T-Rex and a supple, very fast body, sort of like a velociraptor, a la Jurassic Park. Courtney also took me over to a kind of a videodrome device over at Lockheed Skunk Works in Burbank, where he had me practice taking 180-degree and 90-degree turns every 30 seconds looking for predators on the horizon. Because among our civilian jumpers, I was a guard who always carried a photo flash gun in my belt. So I had kind of Pavlovian conditioning at Lockheed about how always to remain wary on the surface for potential predators. That summer of '81, I went over to the Stillings residence in La Cañada, and Thomas Stillings demonstrated that photo flash gun for me by shooting it across their backyard and incinerating a poor little baby goat. And he said, Andy, now go over there and blow on our today's barbecue. And I went over there and the thing just fell apart in ashes. So we were carrying a photo flash device that could incinerate a relatively big animal, maybe an animal the size of a dog or a horse, within about a 100-foot range, but certainly wouldn't protect us from the larger predators. It would really just antagonize them. So in addition to bringing the photo flash gun, Courtney Hunt of the CIA provided me a little capsule of cyanide that I always kept in a plastic pouch in my pocket before going up to Mars via jump room. There were two jump rooms, at least jump rooms that I was told about or had contact with. One was at 999 North Sepulveda in El Segundo, California, in a building owned and operated by Hughes Aircraft. The other was in the CIA complex within the George Washington Bridge facility in New York City. So there's the George Washington Bridge, and there is 999 North Sepulveda. Next one, please. Now, I took two training jumps. The first one took place in July of 1981, and the tradition was to always go up by yourself, because you basically had to confront your demons and go up by yourself, because we had to be expected to do that. So in July of '81, Courtney Hunt drove me in his silver grayish-colored Volvo DL over to 999 North Sepulveda. We walked into the building. In those days, there weren't three huge red 999s on the street corner. There was a little sort of metal 999 on the awning of the building. And I said, great, Courtney. You're setting me up to Mars where my feet are going to be on another planet and the building is 666 upside down. And he laughed in one of those rueful, kind of bronchial, cynical coughs or laughs that only the cigarette-smoking guy from the CIA can laugh in. So then I just pretty much came out of this skull on the surface. The jump room opened, and we would stand in the jump rooms and wait until we were addressed by the intercom. And I was there for about 15 minutes, and I finally said, quoting Alan Shepard at Cape Canaveral in 1961, the year of my birth, I finally said, light this candle, because I was growing impatient just standing there. And I could hear Courtney laughing through the intercom. About 5 minutes later, the lights in the elevator began flashing, and it slowly began morphing from a box into a cylinder with wormholing at the end of the cylinder clockwise. And then about 5 more minutes later, it corrected itself and began unmorphing, and then righted itself after about 15 total minutes back into a box. And then about 5 minutes later, the door opened on the opposite side of the elevator. What this was doing, I don't know. Was it teleportation? I don't think so. What could explain the technical term for the jump rooms, aeronautical repositioning chamber? Well, how about the reverse engineering of those UFOs that have been seen to do this in in our skies, basically begin morphing into different shaped objects. I think maybe the jump room had its origin in that or in technology that was given to us by one of the gray ET species. So the next time, second time in August of '81, I went up with Courtney. We came out of the same skull on the surface, but rather than just standing around for an hour with 3 other jumpers, who I didn't even know their names, they just sort of were an escort group that had greeted me during the first jump, I went up with Courtney, and there was nobody waiting there for us, which certainly implies planning. It certainly implies pretty advanced radio between Earth and Mars. And we walked out of the skull for about a quarter of a mile, and we got to this stone cottage. If you could go back one tick. Yeah, one more. We came to this stone cottage on the surface, like the structure on the right, which I found from some building in the Arizona desert. But basically, there was a small cottage that had been cobbled together with local rock. We walked across the immediate grounds, and as we did so, as we approached the door, a creature that I thought had been a dog, which was chained out to a stake in the yard of this house, but which ended up being a hybrid of a white male with a bald head, but the lower anatomy of like a grub, came bounding across the yard at us, undulating his lower extremities, kind of snarling and barking and talking all at once, kind of like, it didn't really sound like a barking dog. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like some strange guttural cry from a hybrid. We then opened the door. I remember the screen door fell off because it was deteriorating. And there was a man inside, about 50 years old, named Howard, and he began babbling about how most of his team had been killed. And he thought initially, I think, that we were there to kill him. But he began then begging Courtney Hunt to take him home, and Courtney said, no, Howard, I have to take Andy home. So that was kind of tragic, because he was clearly one of the lifers, one of the permanent settlers, who was destined to spend the rest of his life there on Mars until dying in service of our country. We left his small little cottage there, and we walked up to a stand of like a hedge of plants, but unlike on Earth, they had human faces in them. They were almost like those commercials you see on television of like a clownfish with a human face on it, and for some insurance company commercial or something. Very strange. They were like lotus blossoms with human faces. Another example of hybridization on the surface. We then walked about a half a mile along a dirt path, and there were these seal-like or sea lion-like creatures lounging on the hillside to my right. We got to the end of the trail and then turned around to walk back past Howard's house and back to the skull to get access to that particular jump room. And the seal-like creatures began barking like seals, like, arr, 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 arr. And Courtney said, they're saying goodbye to you, indicating that they were a little bit more sapient than seals. But they didn't do anything. They were just still lounging up there on the ridge as we walked back past Howard's cottage. We didn't see him. But then when we got about 50 paces to the skull that we had to get through to get down back into the sub-basement where this particular jump room was, I saw a little flicker of movement from a boulder on my right. And I said, Courtney, is that a predator on the right? He said, I'm afraid so. He says, at the count of 3, I want you to run for the eye sockets of the skull and dive into it like you're diving into home base in a baseball game. So at the count of 3, I took off. Courtney's running beside me. And I saw this boulder closing on my right. And I think, oh, I'm going to eat it here. I'm going to get eaten. We jumped through the eye socket of the skull, and this plesiosaur smacked its face into the skull as we scampered down the stairs to the jump room. So this was an example of the plesiosaurs, which were predators, but we did outrun it, and I'm here to tell the story. So we did two acclimation jumps, and then about 10 exploratory jumps. I did those in 2 separate teams. Here we see the next slide. I was on a team with Courtney Hunt of the CIA serving as senior officer with myself and a younger jumper, William Stillings, under his direction. Next one, please. And then also, did that one come up? And then also, Bernard Mendez led a team that included myself and Barry Soetoro, today known as Barack Obama. And we were just doing things like, we'd come out of a jump room and dig in the ground, and just do basic scientific exploration of a very rudimentary nature. Okay, Then I had a set of mission jumps that were about 30 in number, where I would go from my schooling there at the UCLA campus. I would drive over to a Rand Corporation subsidiary in West Los Angeles. I was being given a floppy disk about 10 years before the floppy disks emerged in the civilian economy, the civilian commercial economy. And I would then drive to El Segundo, go into the jump room, go up to the jump room facility that we called the corkscrew, because it was kind of designed in a conch shape up to the surface, and walk about 3/4 of a mile through a dilapidated brick city and give this floppy disk to one of our people in a telecommunications outpost within the gutted buildings of that dilapidated brick city. Was it a brick city of ultimate earthling design? Possibly. It kind of looked like the old architecture of like the historical district in Philadelphia. I mean, these were small bricks. But I would always give him the disc. He would never say anything. He always reminded me of Daryl Dragon, from The Captain and Tennille. He was a very reticent individual, and I would always try to talk to him and alleviate some of his boredom, and I would give him this disc, and I'd say, "How's it going, man? Are you okay? How are things going?" And he just would never say anything. I think probably because he didn't want to be eaten, so he was keeping the noise down at his particular post because he was sitting there for hours. But I would give this disc to this individual. I never knew his name, but he was working there he had about 8 to 10 sophisticated devices under this semi-collapsed roof within the dilapidated brick city. So that kind of gives you a picture how rudimentary our presence was on Mars in the first half of the 1980s. Next slide, please. Okay, now, there are 5 Martian primates. I mentioned how in the summer of 1970 I saw the first kind, the Homo martis terris. If we could advance and take a look at those. Here's a drawing of what those bald, kind of rugged, earthling-like Martians look like, at least the males of their species. There's also the indigenous Martians. We call them Homo martis martis, or Martian men and women on Mars. And they look more like the traditional phenotype of a Martian in our culture. They're diminutive, they tend to be shorter than us, have longer heads, narrower faces. Sometimes the males have antennae out of their temples. They often have very irregular teeth and pointy chins. They have pointed ears, very long necks, and spindly bodies. But they're certainly more substantial physically than, let's say, a classic gray ET species. They're not that slight, but they're considerably thinner and more spindly than the average human being. Then there was, I saw one of the Homo martis extraterrestrialis, which is kind of a hybrid between a gray ET species and like a lemur or some kind of land-based animal, up on the top of one of the jump rooms one time when I was exiting. There are also these diminutive 1/4 and 1/2 inch Martians that are sort of like little rustic creatures that remind me of the 7 dwarfs. And of course, David Beamer was showing us these little Martians as early as 2006. Some of them crushed under the wheels of our rovers. And then there is a Sasquatch species on Mars that my research organization founded in 2009, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, or MARS. We have found, I don't want to say dozens, but we found many of these Sasquatch-like hominids on Mars. I didn't see any when I was visiting Mars, but we have them in numerous NASA pictures now. And the commonality is they look like Sasquatch, but they tend to be smaller than our Sasquatch. Our Sasquatch can get up into that 7 to 9 foot range, but these are more like 6 feet tall, about the size of an average adult male human on Earth. Now, as I stated just a few moments ago over in the panel, I rest my allegation that there is a secret space program today when Cheryl Jones asked us, what's your evidence, on the fact that I'm proud to have participated kind of as, I think, as the bridge personality in a sense, between the initial 2 Mars jump room whistleblowers and then myself and 4 other individuals who've come forward. So who are those people? And why am I identifying them specifically to this audience? I am going over each of these people very briefly, but just to give them all credit, because it is my position stated today. In other words, I'm alleging that these 7 Mars whistleblowers are all truthful witnesses and whistleblowers. In other words, their testimony is truthful. It's veracious testimony. And again, that's a testimony to that fact, but here are these individuals. The first was Michael C. Ralph, who in 1999 came forward and stated that in 1976 he traveled to Mars via jump room, spent 20 years working there until 1996, and then was age regressed back 20 years and time traveled back 20 years. Michael Ralph, of course, and this is certainly germane to those of you who've been following Corey Goode's account, was the first individual to report the 20 years and back process or experience. When Corey, I wasn't commenting publicly when Michael revealed that in 1999, but I was already a public figure when Corey came forward several years ago. And you may recall, at least some of you have been following this, that I verified the fact that while I was never age regressed intentionally after serving, I didn't have a 20 years and back. When I was serving, however, as a child on Project Pegasus, before jumping via teleportation, via advanced teleportation through a Stargate device from 1972 to 2045, I was placed in a chamber that age progressed me biologically from about age 10 to about age 45. And then I spent 3.5 weeks sequestered at the Sandia National Labs in this medical-like lab with tall walls so nobody could see my condition inside as that age progression gradually wore off. So again, it's a tall drink of water, I know. If I wanted to be believed, why would I be alleging it, right? If I was making it up and wanted to sell a tall tale, why would I share such an unbelievable element? But I'm sharing it because it's the truth. I was age progressed to about 45 before going to 2045, which is just a coincidence, because it was explained to me by my father that they had to age me to that age so there would be no genetic damage when I was sent so far into the future. So retrospective to Michael C. Ralph's account, and certainly now in support of Corey Goode's account and Randy Kramer's account, I can verify that by 1972, the U.S. defense technical community was able to age progress a child from the body of a 10-year-old boy to the body of a 45-year-old man, because it was done to me. And so I'm happy to be in fellowship with those fine individuals and be able to provide that testimony from the early days of the U.S. secret space program. The next individual, the second one to come forward in the modern instance, was, of course, Arthur Neumann, originally as the Henry Deacon whistleblower developed by Bill Ryan and Kerry Cassidy of Project Camelot. Arthur claims that prior to 2006, but only several years before then, he was sent to Mars via jump room for the Lawrence Livermore Labs of Berkeley, California. And then I was number 3. I came forward in 2009, August of 2009, about my jump room experiences after having been lecturing about my time travel experiences in childhood since October of 2004. And that only resulted as a result of the fact that my appearances on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie caused William Stillings and Bernard Mendez to contact me and say, listen, we weren't time traveling with you in the 70s. The reason we've contacted you is we were jumping to Mars with you in the first half of the 1980s. Now, the next of the 7 major Mars jump room whistleblowers, I mentioned again just in the panel, is Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, the great-granddaughter of President Dwight David Eisenhower. Now, how does Laura fit into this? Laura gave testimony in 2009 and 10 that in 2006 and 7, when she was approached to be recruited to go to the Mars colony with her 2 then 10-year-old twin boys, Gavin and Garrick Eisenhower, she stated this in an interview again with Alfred Weber, that she was told that she would be going there via Ark. And I said, what do you mean by that, Laura? Do you think they were analogizing to Noah's Ark? And she said, yes, they were calling these advanced space planes ARK, A-R-K. It came up a couple times in my briefings. And I didn't tell her at the time that, in fact, ARC, A-R-C, was the anagram, it was the initials for the technical term for the jump rooms, aeronautical repositioning chamber. So here's my position. Honestly, I'm kind of grown weary with the resistance to the fact that we've been spending trillions of dollars on these programs, that there is a secret space program. I mean, look, I'm a good, honorable person. I've lived a responsible, loving life, and I've been called everything, even a mass murderer. You know, when I originally broke my Mars findings, Richard Hoagland claimed that I was a non-person. I was a CIA legend. I've been accused of being financially interested, a liar, crazy, a CIA agent. I'm none of those things. I am a former American astronaut, okay? Worthy of the respect of that office. You know, I think about the fact that when John Glenn circled around the Earth in space in February 20th of 1962, he came back, and the next day, a couple days later, he was given a ticker tape parade in New York City. I mean, 30, 35, 40 years after my experiences, almost 50 years after I first teleported, I find myself defending my character against false allegations. But here's my position. If you can't believe as intelligent and wonderful an individual as Laura, who happens to be the great-granddaughter of one of our most successful, honorable military leaders and presidents, Dwight David Eisenhower, when she says that in 2006 they tried to get me to go to Mars, and then doesn't know she's giving the advanced technical term for the jump rooms, then you really can't believe anything. You're going to be one of those people who's not going to believe the 80 Roswell crash witnesses. You're going to hold out to see if Stanton Friedman disproves Harry Truman's signature on the MJ-12 documents. Okay? I mean, I could not rent a more reliable character witness or just witness than Laura. She is such a virtuous person, and she happens to be from a presidential family. How often do members of presidential families come forward and say, oh yeah, I want you to know that I was invited to go to Mars? Okay, I mean, we have so few examples. I think it was Amy Carter came out against apartheid in South Africa and the nuclear arms race when she was in college. But let's face it, as Dr. Sala, I think, has done such great work in working with Laura and other of these true whistleblowers that I've had the honor of coming forward with, Laura is an utterly reliable witness. And in coming forward, she didn't even know that she was revealing the advanced technical term for the device, the aeronautical repositioning chamber. And I think that's groovy. From a trial lawyer's perspective, that's wonderful testimony. The next individual was a young technical genius, again, William Brett Stillings. Brett contacted me on April 23rd of 2010 about the fact that we had served together. And then after we were on Coast to Coast AM on 11/10/11 with Laura, Bernard Mendez came forward. So here we had the defense investigator coming forward as a whistleblower. This is exceptional. These are multiple people. Look, if I was a trial lawyer who had smoked too much dope, you think all these people would be coming forward to verify what I've been saying? You think I'd be able to link Michael C. Ralph's account in 1999 to the current testimony of these other people? These people live all over the country. They have different lifestyles, different walks of life, different trades, different professions, and yet they've come together as 7 whistleblowers, because not only has Bernard Mendez now come forward, but William Whitecrow, who was known back in the day as William Paris, who then became a metaphysician and took a Native American name. In April of 2016, William Whitecrow came forward and stated on Facebook, I was Andrew Basiago's martial arts instructor in 1971-72 when he was time traveling for DARPA. I guarded his life on Mars and ran into him in 1982-83. Andy's experiences embody the contribution that's been made to our space program by the U.S. Chrononaut Corps, and I endorse him for president. Now look, if I had all the money in the world and was lying, could I bribe such a character reference from somebody who had a distinguished career in the United States Army? Whitecrow came forward and not only verified that I had been time traveling for DARPA, but that he met me on Mars and then endorsed me for the highest office in the land. So I apologize for being kind of overbearing. I really haven't emphasized this as strongly in the past. But these 7 witnesses are great witnesses. They're witnesses that would turn any trial, even a felony murder conviction, could be sustained on the testimony of these 7 fine people. And I salute all of my 6 colleagues for coming forward. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I'm just saying, you know, I've earned my props. We have earned our props. These are 7 intelligent, kind, generous, high-spirited, believable, credible, truth-telling people. I've done my work. We now have 7. Not 1, not 0, but 7. Okay. So the next I'd like to cover, there were some luminaries that I know were involved or that I met along the way in the jump room program. The first I found from Bernard Mendez, that the defense intelligence analyst in retirement in San Clemente, So I guess my own file crossed his desk in San Clemente at some point, was Richard Milhous Nixon. The CIA was working with Nixon. He employed for it as an intelligence analyst, and he was the chief technical analyst in retirement after leaving the White House in August of '74 in disgrace, resigning, in retirement in San Clemente. The next individual that William Whitecrow and I have given a number of interviews, much public testimony at this point about meeting at the jump room building in El Segundo, was a man who was supposed to be dead already, but he was quite alive, and that was Howard Hughes, the legendary aviator, the man who owned the building that the jump room was in. What had happened was Bernard Mendez had collapsed when we were walking back to one of the jump rooms, and I fireman carried him. I don't know how far. It was a mile, a half mile. It could have been 900 feet for all I know, but with the deficient oxygen supply on Mars, I just about got him back into the jump room and got myself back in. I was just utterly exhausted. I was kind of pancaking like this, doing a fireman's carry when I finally got back into the jump room and dropped him into the jump room itself. He ended up waking up in a Los Angeles hospital. So we really don't know what happened. Bernie either had a hypoxia attack or some kind of stress-related collapse. So after I brought Mendez into the jump room on my shoulder, Mr. Hughes wanted to meet me. And I said, somebody asked me at the facility, do you want to meet Mr. Hughes? And I'm not thinking Howard Hughes, because I had read my share of news magazines in the 70s, and I thought he had died. Didn't he die back in 1976? And in this emaciated condition with long hair and fingernails and that whole scene? Well, Hughes was still alive in 1982-83. That's the testimony of Whitecrow and I. Now, Richard Dolan's asking for documents, but I would also state that testimonial corroboration is corroboration. That's part and parcel of the evidential process. Who corroborates our claim that Hughes was still alive into the 1980s? Major General Mark Music of the U.S. Army and Douglas Wellman, a former dean of students at USC, have written a book called Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes, in which they claim that Hughes lived to 2001 and that his death was faked in 1976 so that he could work on sensitive defense projects connected to the CIA, like the Glomar Explorer and the Mars Jump Room program. So I went down to Hughes' office and he said, "Oh, this is Andy? You're Andy? Oh, hi, Andy. Howard Hughes." And it didn't even strike me that it was Howard Robert Hughes, the legendary aviator and air designer, airplane designer. But that's really the historical origins and I think significance of the Jump Room program as a federal program. It was really the last great aviation accomplishment of one of our legendary and most accomplished aviation pioneers, Howard Hughes. Now, another thing that we've been able to do in our conversations with Wellman and Music about their recent biography of Hughes, where they allege that his death was faked in '76 and that he lived to 2001, is talk about the man we met. So, for example, I remember going down to his office a couple times when he was a reasonable person, but I remember at least 2 or 3 times when he was chewing his secretary out on the phone, and you almost felt like you wanted to leave and take a shower. It was so vicious. And Wellman and Music have verified for Whitecrow and I that Howard Hughes was very bipolar and in his manic swing could be an utterly vicious person. I mean, he wouldn't strike out physically, but it was just really hurtful, his approach to his colleagues when he was swinging bipolar, and they verified that. One time I think I actually left the room rather than hear this tirade. Do you know who I am? I'm Howard effing Hughes, and we talked about this yesterday. How stupid are you? It was kind of that kind of beratement of a colleague, and there were more than one of those in his presence, so he had some mental problems. This lovely woman is Laura's aunt, Mary Jean Eisenhower. On a March 3rd, 1983 jump at night that we call the night run that I was on with Bernard Mendez and Regina Dugan and a third female, I asked one of the women when we were over in a dormitory in West Los Angeles near the jump room facility whether she was related to the Eisenhower, and she said yes, the one and only. So while Laura has never come forward with her aunt's participation in the jump room program, she's never denied it, and she never denied to me that Mary Jean was involved. So there, just as there was a Basiago family involvement, a Stillings family involvement, there was an Eisenhower family involvement. President Eisenhower's meeting with the ETs. Mary Jean Eisenhower's background as one of the Mars jumpers. Laura Eisenhower and her 2 sons' recruitment effort in 2006 and 2007. So I hope one day that Mary Jean Eisenhower will come forward The explanation I've gotten from the Eisenhower family is that she's been ill. I've got some medical problems myself. We're all getting older. We certainly were damaged by some of these technologies. So I just want to say, though, that Laura has never denied my testimony that I did one jump with her aunt, Mary Jean. Somebody else I met on the surface was an Annapolis grad. There's the Navy connection to time travel and the secret space program again, Admiral Stansfield Turner. Can we bring that up, the next one up? Who had been Jimmy Carter's CIA director. Is that coming up? There he is. I thought it was that Bigfoot researcher, Peter, God, I'm forgetting his name. He was a British researcher. Oh, I forget, but it was actually, he comes over to Bernard Mendez and I, dressed in a pith helmet and a cravat, you know, tan shirt and shorts and boots and everything, and says, "Hi, fellas, Stan Turner. Is this a weird, wicked place or what?" You know, and it was Admiral Turner of the Navy High Command. And another naval graduate, I didn't think it was Ross Perot, but there was a guy named Ross who was a very talkative Texan, and I remember being in his presence a couple times on the surface, and I'm doing head checks at 90 and 100-degree angles, protecting my team members, while this talkative Texan would just sit there and go on and on and on and never look around. He had such personal presence that he had no fear of being seized from behind by a predator and eaten. And I'm like actively on guard for that. But Ross Perot has been verified as being one of the jumpers, again, an Annapolis graduate, by one of his grandchildren's spouses to me personally. Now, there's a debate between William Stillings and Bernard Mendez and I as we were going to the actual Mars. Were we going to a synthetic quantum environment? Okay, really? How much? Any? Are we over? Okay. All right, so I'll leave you with this. There was basically a debate. There is a debate, and it's a friendly debate, between my fellow jumpers, William Stillings and Bernard Mendez and I. Brett thinks we were going to the actual Mars. We could see Phobos and Deimos up in the sky. NASA has been lying about things like temperature and pressure and water and so forth. Bernard Mendez has stated that he thinks that it was proved during our experiences that we were visiting a kind of a bubble or synthetic environment in time-space that he and I named a synthetic quantum environment. This would be an artificial planetary domain, let's say, architected by the gray ETs. I think that we were probably using some form of not teleportation, but exoplanetary chronovision. In other words, I think that the chronovision technology of the early 70s was focused so we could take it off planet so that we were visiting the actual Mars, but in a way that was holographic. But I'll say, at the end of the day, both in terms of an interaction with my mother and a co-ed sitting next to me at a history class at UCLA, the red dirt of Mars, the red dust of Mars was detected on my shoes. So we were going to an actual place off planet in time space. Does it ultimately matter to the history of the secret space program whether it was the red planet or some other planetoid? I don't think so. My emphasis is to say, look, this was a real program. We were going to a place that we had trained and they had told us was Mars. And we were going there in a sophisticated technology that has never been reported, it has never been revealed to the American people. So just in closing, if you look at my presidential platform from 2016, it's at andy2020.net. You'll find my 100 proposals. In them, I have an ET transparency proposal and a Mars transparency proposal. I have vowed that if in their wisdom the American people decide to elect me their president, just as they elected my fellow Mars jumper Barack Obama, I will be the truth president. I will tell the American people the truth about our extraterrestrial history, the ET cover-up, the ET liaison programs, the Mars jump room program, and the kinds of things that young men like Corey Good and Randy Kramer are providing testimony to. Because when we begin having a presidency that tells the truth, this great country will enjoy a new birth of freedom. Thank you. So I kind of went long. I don't know if we...